Why we didn't start yet? Yes. Hello everyone, welcome again. Now it's the second session of our Freedom Convention 2022, and our moderator for this session will be Sueda Polat. Sueda is a graduate of Emory University, where she pursued a major in sociology and a minor in Arabic. As a researcher, she has explored the topics of race and inequality and socialization of Muslim American children. She's committed to human rights advocacy and community service, and she is the main coordinator of our youth team in Advocates of Silence Turkey. And the floor is yours, Sueda. I'm going back. I'm going to be here, but I'm not here.
Thank you very much for introducing me, Ms. Girdap. Welcome again, dear human rights fighters. We just concluded our previous session with some brilliant addresses from prominent human rights defenders, replete with personal anecdotes and lessons in fighting the good fight. So we're starting the second session, as Ms. Girdap said, of the Freedom Convention on this Human Rights Day. In this session, we'll be talking about the crackdown on freedom of expression in Turkey. We'll be discussing this through the issues of silencing the media and the academia, as well as the regime's stigmatization and polarizing discourse and its crimes against humanity. Once again, we'd like to ask our audience to tweet about this event with the hashtag Human Rights Day, and to mention our account, Silenced Turkey. You can ask questions and share your comments on the YouTube live chat so that we can address them at the end with our panelists in a Q&A session. Thank you in advance for your support. So first, I'd like to introduce the first speaker of this session, Professor Mohammed Shafi Amarmi. Professor Amarmi is a legal consultant and the current Commissioner for Social Cohesion and Nation Building in the Republic of South Africa, and also a former commissioner on the South African Human Rights Commission. Professor Amarmi was a visiting professor at Ohio University as a Robert and Reen Glidden visiting professor, bringing with him a lifetime of expertise and experience. Amarmi has a long and distinguished record of advocating for the poor and oppressed within the Republic of South Africa and also internationally. Most notably, his efforts in this regard included serving on the South African Human Rights Commission from 2014 to 2021. Welcome, Professor Amarmi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sweda, and to your listeners as well. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very humbled to be here. And yeah, we need to be talking about the 74th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and contextualize the fundamental freedoms that the world is trying to cling on to post-World War II. But it seems that, the challenges are getting bigger and bigger. And, it means that human rights activists around the world need to become more and more conscious and more vigilant about the violation of their rights. Obviously, we will talk about the torture that's happening in Turkey, but also those are civil and political rights. But we will also be talking about violations of socioeconomic rights as well. So it's interlinked, and I can contextualize it within the framework of the South African Constitution and the Bill of Rights, include as well as benchmarking it against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the powerful institutions that we have in the Human Rights Council that we can engage, and also then use the Treaty of Rome, on the ICC, and call on states that are part of the Treaty to Rome to support the human rights activists in their journey to defend democracy and human rights. Let me stop there, and we can take it from there, unless you want me to talk the full 10 minutes. I'm in your hands, Sweda.
Yes, we would love if you could talk the full 10 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much. So let me start off here and say to you that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, obviously, there are only 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We know where it has come from. It has come from, post-World War II, where the world basically said that, after the horrendous things that happened during World War II, we want to create a world that is based on peace, and we never want to go back into a state where the world goes back into war. But the history of that, unfortunately, is, as we reflect on the 74 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we find more and more that states are disrespectful for human rights, primarily because they invoke Article 2.7 of the Universal, not Universal Declaration of the United Nations Organization Charter, right? That established the UNO. Now they use that to say that, you know, whatever happens internally is no business of the rest of the world, and therefore the world can turn a blind eye or to the atrocities that people commit. Now, over the years, what's happening is we see the states are becoming very powerful, and many of them, you know, there are many of them that respect the rule of law and the independence of the rule of law in the judiciary, but there are many others who basically, you know, basically fall foul of that rule itself. Now, what it does to the citizen on the ground, it makes our lives very, very difficult. Now, let me start off by saying that, you know, in the South African human rights, South African Constitution, which has an entrenched Bill of Rights, right? We have what we call an egalitarian and transformative vision of a constitution, you know, and it's backed up by the establishment of the South African Human Rights Commission in terms of the South African Human Rights Commission Act 40 of 2013. And we all realize that the purpose of that was basically to protect, promote, and advance, and educate, and monitor, and this is very important, and monitor the realization of human rights. And that in terms of the equality principles, everybody is equal before the law, and not even the president of the Republic of South Africa is above the law, and he knows it as well. So the Human Rights Commission Act basically has biting powers to bite where it is necessary to bite, and to hold the state accountable in terms of the equality clauses. Now, the Bill of Rights in South Africa basically talks about civil and political rights, and it talks about socio-economic rights. And both those rights are justiciable within the framework of the rule of law. And the constitutional court that we have is the apex court, you know, on all adjudication matters on the rule of law and human rights. And we take our rights very serious, given that we come from a very horrible apartheid past, which we never want our children or their children to ever go through that again. And within the framework of that, I'm going to my fourth point, and basically to say that all rights are indivisible, all human rights, whether they're civil and political rights or whether they're socio-economic in nature. And all rights are there's an interdependence of rights, and there is an interlinking of all human rights. So we do not distinguish in South African Constitution between civil and political rights and or socio-economic rights. All rights are justiciable, and we do not have those distinctions of first-generation rights and second-generation rights and third-generation rights, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, basically is chopped up into those kind of things. We see all rights as a bundle of a series of rights, promoting the rule of law, equality before the law, and non-discrimination. Having said that, in the South African Human Rights Constitution, the Bill of Rights in Chapter 2, we're looking primarily at, in this particular case, in relation to the report that is the subject of our discussion today, we're looking at the freedom and security of person. We're looking at freedom of religion, belief, and opinion. We're looking at the freedom of expression, right? And the freedom of association as well. And and the freedom, the assembly, you know, the freedom to assemble and demonstrate and picket and petition. These rights are sacrosanct in the Bill of Rights in South Africa. And therefore, I'm benchmarking it within those the parameters of those rights to talk to the issues, you know, to say that what is the purpose? I mean, how can we reinforce and make sure that the Universal Declaration of Rights, you know, and all 194 states in the world, including Turkey, right, are bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, if you look at Article 5, 6, 7, Article 5 that talks that no one shall be subject to torture or cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Obviously, the report that that you have produced basically highlights all those ones. No one shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, and exile. Now, here we're looking at people who overnight, for example, the Hizmet movement, overnight became, refugees in their own country. They became, they could seek asylum elsewhere, like many others who are doing around, in the migratory patterns that are happening all over the world, where your passports are being taken arbitrarily, making you stateless. And these are all against the conventions that all goes against the conventions in the international conventions in different forms. I am then saying what we need to be perhaps doing without belaboring the point, because everybody has read that report and I'm not going to go through that report. But what we need to then do as civil society organizations, obviously the Human Rights Council has a complaint procedure. We should engage that procedure to voice our objections to that. Call on the Human Rights, the Human Rights Council to establish a commission of inquiries and fact-finding missions to go and look into these kind of problems. Because I mean, the problems are there. They've been highlighted in this report very beautifully and articulately. We're basically saying, okay, the special procedures, perhaps we should now call, the Human Rights Council, right, to invoke its special procedures to look into these kind of injustices and take the process from there as well. Now, what I think should happen from my perspective here, because I know there are other colleagues that will also want to add to the discussion, is basically now to say that how we cement all these international mechanisms, treaty mechanisms. If we can call on the states who are party to signatory to the international, the Rome Convention, right, that established the International Criminal Court, those parties have a duty to assist the human rights defenders throughout the world, right, to basically take, states who have violated human rights, like in this case, what's happening is, for example, in the Silence to Turkey report, what comes out very clearly for me is the violations on the rights of the Convention of the Child. Nobody talks about that. They keep quiet about it, right? The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Mothers and babies have been jailed arbitrarily, right? And nobody talks about that as well. So it's like business as usual. Now, if we are going to go forward in terms of what we want out of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, and I'm saying next year, this time we'll be talking about the same thing, we must have put in mechanisms to say, you know what have we done from our side, right? We've created the awareness, we've created the advocacy around the issues. What is the impact now around? Maybe we need to go for the international tribunals where we need to be talking about this. And I think in conclusion, what I'd like to say is, if we do not, what I'd like to see happening is, and I'm saying this, we need to have a pledge. And a pledge would be like, we pledge to be fair, to be fair, to share success, to help alleviate suffering of the less privileged, to do what we can do to uplift the downtrodden, in the sure knowledge that in what we do, we lift ourselves, our countries, and the world, and we create hope for the future. Now, I'd like to say, the last thing that I'd like to say is, it's all about rights. In order for us to protect rights, we need to commit ourselves to do the following. We need to transform society. We need to secure rights, right? And we need to restore dignity to all, everybody. For without rights, there can be no freedom. Without freedom, there can be no development. And without development, there can be no transformation. And without transformation, there is no dignity nor social justice. Chairperson, I'd like to say that, what I find very interesting about this conversation today is, 2 days ago, I was in an international Zoom platform at the university, at the Toronto Metropolitan University, where we were talking about the impact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the journey going forward from there. What we've come up, what I've learned in Toronto, for example, in Canada. Canada basically, it's a first world country. There's serious problems around the issue of housing, evictions, and homelessness. I'm sitting here in Toronto right now, and it's -6 degrees. Can you imagine a person that is sitting out in the cold, mothers, children, right, that have to go through this for this period of time, and for God knows how long, forever, But equally, those are socioeconomic in nature. And therefore, I'm saying what I'm seeing in the Silence to Turkey report itself is about the gross violations of civil and political rights, right? We need to stand up for these things. We need to stand and speak truth to power, because as Martin Luther King Jr. said, an injury to one is an injury to all. An injustice anyway is an injustice everywhere, you see. And therefore, in conclusion, I'd like to say, Chairperson, what President Mandela said, you know, he said that when we basically got our freedoms, he said we succeeded to take our last steps to freedom in conditions of relative peace. We commit ourselves to the construction of a complete, just, and lasting peace. We have triumphed over in the effort to implant hope in the breast of millions of our people. And we enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of the inalienable right to human dignity. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and with the world. And therefore, I'm saying is, for those people, for example, in South Africa, we extend our hands to even those people that have become stateless overnight. We didn't say you've got to live in a particular camp like what's happening in Kenya, where they have the Al-Shabaab camp for refugees and people who are stateless. We embrace them in the principles of Ubuntu, within the framework of the preamble of our constitution, in order to create the hope that society at large and the world at large needs. Let me stop there, then I'll take questions further from that, Chairperson. Thank you very much. I hope I've exhausted my 10 minutes, I think.
Yes, thank you so much for packing so much information in those 10 minutes. We really appreciate you pointing out that, of course, declarations are making distinctions within rights, but the South African example shows us that, like you said, they are a bundle, and without one, others are also at risk. You ended with saying that our goal is to transform society for the sake of human dignity. It's a lofty goal, but not impossible, I hope. And the South African example is truly a beacon of hope in that regard. With that being said, we can move on to our second speaker of the session, Mr. Gökhan Toy. Gökhan Toy is a Canadian lawyer and a former Turkish diplomat. He worked as a legal counsel in the legal consultancy unit of the Human Resources Department at the headquarters of the Turkish Foreign Ministry. In this position, he actively participated in personnel investigations, institutional development projects, drafting new regulations and judicial procedures against the ministry, and submitted legal opinions about draft texts of international agreements. He served at the Turkish Consulate General in Toronto as a vice consul between March 2014 and July 2016. He is currently a member in good standing of the Law Society of Ontario, Canada, and is practicing immigration and refugee law. Gökhan Toy holds an LLM degree in Canadian common law from the University of Toronto and an LLB degree from Bilkent University. He lives in Toronto, Canada with his family. The floor is yours, Mr. Toy.
Thank you very much, Sueda. And I would like to welcome all participants, and I would like to thank esteemed professor for his excellent introduction for today's session. Today, I would like to draw your attention to a significant question and ongoing debate. I will discuss whether the human rights violations in Turkey targeting the Gülen movement members amount to the level of crimes against humanity. Like when we speak about crimes against humanity, mostly tragic, bloody, and major historical atrocities come to mind. But the fact is there are many ongoing atrocities in the world in the form of crimes against humanity, including Turkey. So today my focus will be on the persecutory measures taken against the members of Gülen movement. Firstly, I would like to give a legal framework and a description of crimes against humanity. Then I will try to illustrate these persecutory measures taken against the members of the movement. Before starting my brief presentation, I would like to mention that my presentation will be based on a report prepared by my former colleagues and international legal practitioners. The report titled Human Rights Violations in Turkey, Rising to the Level of Crimes Against Humanity, Case of Gülen Group. This report was prepared by Dr. Yasir Gökçe, Mr. Mehmet Bozkaya, Mr. Hakan Kaplankaya, and Mr. Harun Reşit Halisoğlu. They are members of our Institute for Economy and Diplomacy, and all of them are legal practitioners. So I would like to acknowledge their efforts and this precious work. Let's start with the legal framework for the crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity can be defined as offenses and crimes whose commissions shock the conscience of international community and demeans all human race members, regardless of where they live or which culture they come from. There are various definitions employed by different judicial bodies. In this brief presentation, I will make my reference to the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court. Article 7, paragraph 1 of the statute states that the attack constituting crimes against humanity against a civilian population must be widespread or systematic. So we need to have a population, and this attack targeting the population must be widespread or systematic. So this definition includes the following elements. The crimes can occur in the time of peace, and the target of crime can be any civilian population, and the perpetrators of these crimes can be anyone, including head of a state, and the conduct of crime must involve the multiple commission of the acts. Finally, these acts must be done in pursuant to a state or organizational policy. When we mention the widespread attack, this requirement requires a large scale of acts, like including the number of victims. Like it must consist of a large scale, and the systematic attack requirement a pattern of control and direction or intensity by the de facto or de jure authorities of a certain state. So when we come to the population, the prototypical example of a civilian population can be a particular national, ethnic, or religious group. Either you accept them as a religious group or a social movement or a political group. Gülen movement followers under this legal definition can be described as a civilian population because of their large scale and their distinctive characteristics. So when we, according to relevant international case law, the systematic character refers to the commission of illegal acts in accordance with a predetermined plan or policy. So in the case of Gülen movement, the initial rules of the persecution is based on a predetermined policy, we can say. First, we have a 2004 resolution from National Security Council of Turkey. It is too early, from 2004. It is entitled Measures Against the Activities of Fethullah Gülen Group. And it is the initial, consisting the initial rules of the policy. Secondly, I can mention that another Turkish National Security Council resolution, it is published shortly before the July 15 coup attempt. I believe it was in May. And this was, in this resolution, the Gülen Group was designated as a so-called terrorist organization by the Turkish National Security Council, which was led by the President Erdogan. After this decision, the illegal acts committed against a negligible number of followers have considerably intensified and increased and extended to almost all members, perceived or factual members of the group. And following the July 15th coup attempt, the violations and the illegal acts reach to its full potential. So there are many persecutory measures demonstrating the systematic character of the violations, such as tagging and profiling individuals affiliated with the group, Gülen group, creating the list of criteria, like namely photometer criteria, and dismissing an excessive number of civil servants based on these criteria, and prosecuting a massive number of people based on illegal profiling or extrajudicial intelligence reports produced and dispatched by the Turkish intelligence service. These are all persecutory measures prepared on a systematic basis. So, and these measures have a recurring, unabated, and continuous nature. They are repetitive, recurring, and progressing in an unceasing course. And they are, rather than being individual or isolated, they are repetitive. So, with regards to the widespread character of the human rights violations against Gülen followers in Turkey, I would like to make a quotation. According to the relevant case law, the violations resulting from illegal and inhumane acts are considered widespread, quote, when the inhumane acts are committed on a large scale, meaning that the acts are directed against a multiplicity of victims. The term large scale is sufficiently broad to cover various situations involving multiplicity of victims, for example, as a result of the cumulative effect of a series of inhumane acts or the singular effect of an inhumane act of extraordinary magnitude, end of quote. So in light of the relevant case law about the widespread requirement, the massive and frequent violations carried out by the Turkish government with considerable seriousness directed against a large number of people satisfy the second requirement of the crime. So, as pointed out by the opinion of United Nations Working Group on arbitrary detention, these massive features of the illegal acts and their considerable consequences establish a dangerous pattern that consists the widespread character of the illegal acts, and this satisfies the legal qualification. So after this legal framework, now I would like to briefly touch on the specific crimes constituting crimes against humanity by the Turkish government against the members of the movement. It is very long, but I will make a summary. In the case of members of Gülen movement in Turkey, we can assess these severe human rights violations under four main subcategories. These are, the first one is imprisonment or other serious deprivation of liberty. The second is enforced disappearances. The third is torture and sexual offenses. And the fourth is persecution and other inhumane acts. So for the first one, imprisonment or other serious deprivation of liberty, to qualify as an act as a crime of imprisonment, it must be arbitrary, unlawful, and without due process of law. Article 7, paragraph 1E of the International Criminal Court Statute states that deprivation should amount a violence of fundamental rules of international law. Arbitrariness refers to the inappropriate, unjust, unforeseeable, or disproportionate nature of detention. In the case the grounds for detention are illegal or the victim has not been informed of the reasons for the arrest, or procedural rights of the victim have not been observed, or victim has not been brought before the judge within a reasonable amount of time, or such detention, imprisonment should be deemed arbitrary. So in assessing the case of Gülen followers in Turkey, like tens of thousands of people affiliated with the movement are being subject to imprisonment for approximately 6 years to 10 years, just based on their affiliation. Most of these cases are being initiated because of their affiliation and links to the group, so-called FETÖ organization. And such affiliations are being explained by the AKP government and Turkish judiciary with reference to no violent acts or threats or such acts, just based on like links, affiliation of the group. On the contrary, most of the persons detained in the context are considered as terrorists because of their using of a specific encrypted messaging application by lock, or depositing money to a legal bank, Bank Asya, or studying or having their kids studied at the Hizmet movement schools, Gülen movement schools, or attending religious meetings like sohbet meetings, or subscribing like daily Zaman newspaper or other periodicals of the movement. These are the sufficient reasons for arbitrary detention and jail time. Turkish judiciary doesn't make any assessment to reveal the alleged terrorism related intentions. And in this context, it is clear that these acts of the people have nothing to do with terrorism or like any kind of violent acts in nature. They just participated or they just exercised their fundamental rights and like attending meetings or subscribing to a periodical or like depositing money whenever you were. This is the exercise of the fundamental rights. So consequently, it can be conceived that these factual bases of imprisonment have been employed to intimidate or punish political opponents of the government rather than establishing violent purposes. Based on these facts, Turkish officials have committed crimes against humanity in the form of imprisonment, arbitrary imprisonment and deprivation of liberty. Secondly, enforced disappearances. This is very tragic. Like under Article 7, Paragraph 2 of the International Criminal Court Statute, the crime of enforced disappearance means, quote, the arrest, detention, or abduction of persons by or with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of state or a political organization, followed by a refusal to acknowledge that deprivation of freedom or to give information on the fate or whereabouts of those persons with the intention of removing them from the protection of law for a prolonged period of time. This is a definition, end of quote. This is a definition of the enforced disappearance. I would like to briefly explain what happens in Turkey for this crime. In light of this legal framework, Turkish authorities have committed several crimes of enforced disappearance in a widespread and systematic character. There are many victims of this crime. Mr. Gökhan Türkmen, Mr. Yasin Ugan, Mr. Mustafa Yılmaz, Mr. Yusuf Bilge Tunç, and Mr. Hüseyin Galip Küçüközyiğit. These gentlemen are among those individuals who went missing allegedly as a result of the operations of the Turkish intelligence service. There are many others who went missing and were later handed over to the police or judicial authorities after being interrogated under torture for months. So before their disappearance, all were being prosecuted over the alleged links with the Gülen group, or they have all lost their jobs and their employment before they disappeared. And these people all went missing under similarly suspicious circumstances, with the exception of Mr. Yusuf Bilge Tunç and Mr. Küçük Özyiğit, Hüseyin Galip Küçük Özyiğit, because they are still missing. If I'm not wrong, Mr. Tunç is missing and Mr. Özyiğit, Küçük Özyiğit is also missing. The other victims reappeared in the police custody after a couple of months in Ankara. So these cases of abductions and forced disappearances by the intelligence service in several provinces have not been adequately or at all investigated. Cevheri Güven, Mr. Cevheri Güven, exiled journalist, he investigated the stories of some of these victims, and according to him, these abductees were taken by the Turkish intelligence to a specially equipped building in Ankara to torture them. That site used for the torture is specifically called çiftlik in Turkish. It means ranch. And Mr. Güven states that abductees were subjected to severe maltreatment and torture to sign pre-written confessions or to accept some unfounded crimes. In this respect, European Parliament posed a question to European Commission and requested information on secret torture sites located in Turkey. In light of this information, these individuals were abducted and deprived of their liberty with links to the Turkish security agencies, and all abductions were followed by a refusal to acknowledge by the police or other authorities, and their families were not informed at all. Additionally, these kidnappings are not limited to the kidnappings happened in Turkey. There are also some abductions from foreign countries conducted by the intelligence. So in most cases, Turkish authorities bypassed legal procedures to extradite to these people to Turkey, and they were kidnapped through the intelligence operations, and they were brought back to Turkey with private jets, private planes by the Turkish authorities. Very recently, an educator from Kyrgyzstan, Mr. Orhan İnandı, he is a dual citizen, was kidnapped and brought back to Turkey. He appeared in state-run TV, TRT, and the Anatolian News Agency, as handcuffed and tortured. One of his hands were swollen, and then they were bruises on his body. Like, it is very apparent that he was tortured. Similarly, Mr. Mesut and Mrs. Meral Kaçmaz were brought from Pakistan. Mr. Zabit Kişi was brought from Kazakhstan. They were all exposed to torture. So these acts consist of the crimes of enforced disappearance and crimes against humanity. The third point, I would like to briefly mention the torture. The prohibition of torture is well established under international law, and the core element of torture is intentional infliction of severe pain and suffering, whether physical or mental, on a person. So this is one of the severest non-compliances by the AKP government, by the Turkish authorities. It is the practice of torture. The most well-known example is the video footage of tortured top army generals just after the coup attempt. It was disseminated by the state-run TV channel. And apart from this, many reports and testimonies reveal the practice of torture committed by law enforcement officers or intelligence agents. So respectable human rights activists and civil society organizations point out that torture in Turkey has become widespread and systematic in the sense of crimes against humanity. Observations of Freedom House regarding the practice of torture in Turkey in its 2020 Turkey report states that, quote, torture at the hands of authorities has remained common after the 2016 coup attempt and subsequent state of emergency. Human Rights Watch has reported that security officers specifically target Kurds, Gülenists, and leftists with torture and degrading treatment and operate in an environment of impunity. Prosecutors do not consistently investigate allegations of torture, and the government has resisted the publication of European Committee for the Prevention of Torture report on its detention practices, end of quote. So it is very well evident by many sources. Torture is common in Turkey. A couple of cases, for example, many former Turkish diplomats, they were tortured in May 2019 in Ankara police headquarters, despite a well-documented report from the Ankara Bar Association. The prosecutors adopted a decision of non-prosecution about the complaints. Just after the coup attempt, the teacher, Mr. Gökhan Açıkkollu, he was tortured to death, and he just lost his life as a result of the torture, triggered a fatal heart attack, and he lost his life. Mr. Gökhan Türkmen, who was kidnapped and disappeared for months, he just testified in the court that he was tortured for months. And so many human rights defenders and scholars, such as Professor Şebnem Korur Fincancı, who is imprisoned right now in Turkey as well, she suggests that the practice of torture by Turkish state officers follows a widespread and systematic pattern. So this is so tragic, so terrible.
Mr. Toy, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we're running a little low on time. Could we move on?
I'm concluding, yeah, so sorry. Like the last point is sexual offenses. I will just touch on these sexual offenses and the persecution, then I will conclude. With regards to sexual offenses, despite the extensive reports and testimonies on sorts of the other crimes, we have very limited testimonies and the cases. It is underreported because of the cultural, social, and psychological reasons of the victims. But there are many cases. The most common thing, like, it is the victims were suffered rape at the police station with police baton, and also there were rape incidents in the police stations. These acts were committed mostly just after the coup attempt, and these are all reported. The last crime is the crime of persecution and inhumane acts. This crime involved severe deprivation of rights and freedoms against an identifiable group. So Gülen group, Gülen followers in Turkey, they had suffered many forms of persecution. Examples are various. For example, this include enactment of discriminatory law, restriction of movement, destruction of property, attacks on property, hate speech, looting, plunder. In the case of Gülen group, the following acts, some of the acts can be deemed as a crime against humanity of persecution. For example, travel bans, cancellation of passports, and the seizure of property rights of persons or legal entities, like seizure of Koza Holding, Boydak Holding, Kaynak Holding, Dumankaya Construction, Zaman Daily. These are all seized by the government with due process. Destruction and damage given to schools or other institutions of the movement, confiscation of properties, and deprivation of inmates of certain rights in prisons solely only for being a member of the movement or being tried as a member of movement, and mass dismissals from public service. So all in all, based on the legal framework and these crimes committed against a member of the group, we can say that these crimes and atrocities and human rights violations committed against a member of this group have risen to the level of crimes against humanity. The human rights violations that the individuals suffer for their association with the movement should shock the conscience of international community. However, in the absence of an international trial or prosecution, the perpetrators will most likely go unpunished if the international community do not respond. So this subject to your questions, this is the end of my presentation. Sorry for taking your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a comprehensive overview of how the persecution of the Gülen movement actually does fit very aptly under crimes against humanity, where some people or some might question whether it does. You've showed this through definitions that, overlay with examples on the ground why it is so. And as you said, all the actions of the Turkish regime that currently categorizes things as terrorism is merely an exercise of people's fundamental rights in Turkey. We'll be moving on now to Mr. Levent Kenes. He's a Kurdish journalist who was forced to flee to Sweden in 2016 after he was accused of slander by a Turkish court. Mr. Kenes was the former editor-in-chief of the now defunct Meydan newspaper. He was detained in Turkey on July 20, 2016, only 5 days after the coup attempt. The Turkish government is now demanding the extradition of several people it links to the PKK or the Gülen movement, including Mr. Levent Kenes.
Well, thank you very much. Before I go forward, I apologize for my disturbing voice. I'm sick for a while and haven't recovered yet. So sorry beforehand for the coughs and disturbing voice. Well, thank you for the invitation on a very important day, and we are discussing very important issues. I hope this year's Human Rights Day that there will be improvement in the coming days, in the coming months, for the people in Turkey. Well, our session's title is quite wide, so we may reproduce many subtitles: freedom of the press, freedom of the assembly, right to property. So in my part, I would like to share a few of my observations about the situation in Turkey I consider important. And also I would like to mention the methods applied by the Turkish government, especially in silencing critics abroad. As a journalist living in exile, I would like to mention about this. And in the final part, I would like to share my suggestions what can be done in order to overcome government's barriers. No doubt Turkey is characterized or defined as a not free country by international watchdogs and international observers, so there is no need to discuss status of Turkey. But the basis of problems lies in the inexistence of an independent judiciary, I think. When there is a partisan judiciary made up of loyalists and taking orders from the one man, from the president, so things are really, really difficult. In the history of the Turkish Republic, we witnessed military tutelage, elitist dictatorship, so on. But for the first time since the Ottoman Empire, we see a person with his family, with his cronies, has the sole say in the administration of the country. And this is the first time. And the institutions, long-life institutions, have turned paper tigers. It's the first time in the Republic's history. Many of you, I think, will join me in saying that the most important barometer or indicators in terms of freedom of thought in the country is the situation of journalists, and it is determined and measured by the jailed journalists, unfortunately. And when you recall the countries who imprison the most journalists, you will understand what I mean. What Erdogan does in Turkey is simply this. He sends a message to other journalists by imprisoning their colleagues. And the message is clear. You may be the next, or you will be the next. So if the message is well received, the journalist outside the prison resort to self-censorship. In other words, they quote unquote voluntarily give up publishing stories that government doesn't want to hear, doesn't like to hear. So what's accompanied by the self-censorship is that no voice is heard about the people in jail or people tortured or people killed, kidnapped. So no one cares about the others. Another issue is the red lines that bases the foundations of the regime. Let me give an example. For example, when you see some journalists or social media users, they are very vocal about child abuse, environment, animal rights, women's rights. Of course, these are very important issues. But when they come to the corruption allegations, they are very shy. They are very shy about Erdogan's, his family members' relations with the mafia and relations between the government and the mafia, or other controversial incidents that helped Erdogan establish its own regime, like the coup attempt in 2016 or graft allegations in 2013. The reason why I'm telling is that there are some naive foreign Turkish experts or appeasers abroad that, hey, look, there are still opposition parties, there are still opposition journalists, so Turkey it's not so bad. Turkey is still a democracy. No, it's not correct. It's far worse than they think. That's why I'm saying this. Another thing that I would like to mention, journalists and opposition politicians cannot get out the narrative or discourse that imposed by the government. They parrot the same discourse, they parroted the same narrative every day. And at the end of the day, it looks like as if there is a consensus in the whole country about the people whose rights are violated. I mean, Gulen's people, Kurdish people, the vulnerable people, and some people think that if they hadn't committed a crime, this wouldn't have happened. They started thinking like this. So I don't hope any improvement in the freedom of expression in Turkey unless the government's rhetoric is rejected or challenged by the opposition groups. I mean, all the groups. It's like a boomerang. One day it hits you, or if you feed the beast, the other day it will come and eat you. According to recent survey, another issue I would like to point out, almost 60% of Turkish people prefer to get their news from social media or online publications. TV stations are popular, but this number is so huge considering the government controls almost all media in Turkey. It's very, very normal. Internet takes over broadcast in Turkey. There is a new law passed in the parliament in October, a law censoring the media and silencing the dissident ahead of elections. With that, we could see reporters or even social media users jailed for up to 3 years in prison to spread what is branded as fake news. Now, I will give you 2 examples of fake news in Turkey. Let me read this from my notes. Nowhere in the world is the media as free as in Turkey, Mr. President. The second example, the scales of justice in Turkey are more accurate than in the West and than in the United States. Justice Minister, these are my examples. Now, I told you the journalists are under pressure, social media users in Turkey are under pressure. So who will make the news? Who will spread the message? Of course, the journalists and associations or human rights activists abroad. So now the government target them because they are now real danger, because it's easy in the domestically control them. They control almost 95% of the whole media. But the people, the journalists living abroad are now the real problem because we are approaching the new elections. So these journalists are publishing their content freely on social media and abroad. So now they need to be targeted. Now I have Bülent Keneş here, so he's very familiar the methods used. Effort discredited journalists abroad, attacking them. 2 of the incidents unfortunately happened in Stockholm. Extradition requests, Mr. Keneş is very familiar now. Seizure of assets in Turkey, all we have experienced, all our properties are seized, confiscated by the government. travel restrictions by Interpol red notice mechanism, and even Turkish intelligence stalks dissidents abroad and harasses them and even their family members. Pro-media outlets publish addresses of journalists and they publish their surveillance photos provided by the Turkish intelligence. And this is a message: if you continue, bad things may happen to you or to your family members. Thanks. I haven't seen any journalists that take a step back. It's good, but the message is very clear. So what can be done? One of the strategies should be that the expanding the target. When it is only 3 or 4 people or 6, 7 people writing and speaking, it's so easy for the government to deal with this. But if the number becomes 30 and 40, it's practically more difficult. So we need more people to speak up. I don't mean only journalists, but even people in the social media or taking volunteer effort jobs at associations like the AST. We need more people to join these efforts. They say, you know, courage is contagious, so we will need solidarity. Unfortunately, very few people in Turkey realize that the real problem for the economic difficulties in Turkey lies in the existence of a rule of law. The human rights discussions, freedom of blah, blah, blah, these are very luxurious discussions. At the grassroots, the life, how we will survive. This is a problem. So, but at the end, this is so important. If there is no freedom, if there is no democracy, if there is no rule of law, there can be no prosperity. Thank you for listening. I would like to keep it short and have your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kenes. I really appreciate that you touched on the fact that there is a sort of triangulation of responsibility. It's not just the regime that's oppressive, but the opposing party in Turkey need to change their rhetoric as well. And also the public definitely has a role to play here. That shouldn't be overlooked. Thank you. And we'll move on now to our last speaker of the session, Mr. Bülent Kenes. Mr. Bülent Kenes is also a journalist. He's an exiled Turkish journalist and academician who has been the author of 7 books on Iran, Islam, Turkish politics, and human rights. Mr. Kenes, who has over 25 years of experience in journalism, used to be the founding editor-in-chief of the prestigious English daily Today's Zaman. Kenes was also among the founders of Stockholm Center for Freedom. He is now a member of a team establishing the European Center for Populism Studies based in Brussels. Mr. Kenes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sueda, and I thank also Advocates of Silent Turkey for having me at this platform. And I thank so much to the panelists for their interesting presentations. But I will try to approach the issue from a different perspective. First of all, I would like to express some of my disappointments and my wonder. I really and sincerely wonder when will our Western friends and democracies understand the true nature of Erdogan regime in Turkey, as all the friends try to explain. When will the Western democracies give up pursuing and accepting Erdogan regime as if it is a democratic and legitimate regime under the rule of law? And when will they see the kangaroo courts of this regime are just instruments of massive oppression and persecution through fabricating crimes against the millions of innocent people? When will people understand the fact that there is no impartial and independent judicial bodies and courts in Turkey? Since Erdogan mentioned my name 1 month ago during a joint press meeting with Swedish Prime Minister in Ankara as part of NATO membership negotiations, I have given tens of interviews to Swedish and international media. Through these interviews, I have tried to make the people in democracies to understand this true nature of Erdogan regime. Despite these efforts and all efforts done by many colleagues and institutions, the public authorities in my host country, Sweden, unfortunately easily handed a Kurdish Alawite Turkish citizen over to Erdogan regime on the 1st of December, just basing on a controversial verdict given by a Turkish court. I really wonder how many more innocent people who had to seek shelter in democracies, which are assumed to be the rule of law system, will be betrayed by their host countries. I wonder also, how do they take Erdogan's kangaroo courts decisions seriously as if they were legal and fair. It seems to me that it is now time for democratic countries to realize the true nature of the despotic Erdogan regime and act accordingly. You know, Erdogan regime even refuses to comply with the decisions of international courts, top courts of Turkey itself, and these international courts such as the European Court of Human Rights, and legal decisions given by the United Nations legal bodies and the rules of international conventions to which Turkey is a party. We are exactly talking about a despotic regime that has shut down over 200 media outlets in one night, left thousands of journalists unemployed, forced thousands of journalists and academics to live in exile, and imprisoned hundreds of journalists. Erdogan regime, which has no free media, is still one of the biggest jailers of journalists, as mentioned by Levent Kenes. This is such a brutal regime that it didn't hesitate to report about 80,000 of its citizens overnight to Interpol, alleging that they were terrorists. According to the data of Turkish Interior Ministry, this is such a despotic regime that still carries out so-called terrorism investigations against more than 2 million of its own citizens. Who can claim that such a regime is the rule of law? My international colleagues often ask me, why is Erdogan calling you a terrorist? I usually reply to this question by saying that I am not a terrorist, but a journalist. However, I do not take it as a personal issue. I am just one of those more than 2 million innocent Turkish citizens from different ideological backgrounds and different walks of life that the Erdogan regime has opened so-called legal investigation by stigmatizing them as terrorists. Then, of course, I add, imagine in a country of 83 million population, together with their close family members, at least 10-12 million people currently live under the deep anxiety and stress that either they or their closest relatives can be detained, imprisoned, even tortured or killed at any time on the allegations that they are terrorists. Could any democratic state of law inflict such a horror on 1 out of 8 of its population? If one should talk about terror or terrorism, yes, this is a real terrorism done by despotic Erdogan regime. During this presentation, taking the risk of being boring, if I remind some figures about the judicial system in Turkey, maybe it will help to understand the gravity of the situation in the country. Perhaps you know that 1,600 lawyers were arrested in Turkey between July 2016 and December 2021. Of these, 615 lawyers are still in pretrial detention. Over 470 lawyers were sentenced to a total of 3,000 years in prison for alleged membership of a terror organization. Even presidents of bar associations in 15 out of 81 provinces are amongst these lawyers. Can a country in which even the defenders need defense be a state of law which is respectful to universal standards of human rights and freedoms? On the other hand, in the wake of controversial coup attempt in July 15, 2016, 4,500 prosecutors and judges were arbitrarily dismissed from their duties. In other words, 30% of the total prosecutors and judges in Turkish judiciary were arbitrarily purged, and more than 2,700 of them were arrested later. Erdoganist militants with no judicial experience were placed in these vacated positions, and mass influx of these militants into the judiciary continued for years until today. Thus, the Turkish judiciary has completely been removed from being a justice mechanism. It has been turned into a partisan instrument of oppression and persecution. It is not a surprise to see that Turkey is ranked 117th in the index of World Justice Project. The situations at police department and gendarmerie are not different. After the dismissal of tens of thousands of police officials and military officers, these security institutions were also transformed into Erdogan's partisan militia. Now, the so-called judiciary and these security organizations are trying to increase their cruelty and persecution by fabricating new crimes against those that they see as opposition. Or sometimes opposition means terrorist, or terrorist means opposition in Turkey. These new persecution tactics also target tens of thousands of regime opponents in exile, including journalists and academics. As it is well known, the Erdogan regime could not get any results from the political crimes it fabricated about these innocent people previously. The regime has learned from its experience and is now systematically trying to fabricate criminal or financial crimes against people in exile to use them for prospective demands for their extraditions. According to some news stories, if the people they targeted were previously working in bureaucracy, they would be charged with fabricated bribery and corruption crimes. If they were businessmen or self-employed, they will be baselessly accused of financing terrorism, sexual harassment, or even rape. If they were employees of the security bureaucracy, crimes such as torture and ill treatment will be fabricated about them. How do I know this? Of course, I know best from my own experience. Let me explain a bit. You know, an ordinary news article about a financial situation of Turkish Airlines basing on the data in its annual balance sheet that appeared years ago in the economy section of today's Zaman Daily, which I used to be founding editor-in-chief before it was arbitrarily confiscated by Erdogan regime, became the subject of a so-called legal investigation and became a basis for unimaginable and stupid accusations against me years later. Without obeying any legal rule and without relying on any material evidence, I have now been tried on charge of making an unfair profit through market fraud and market manipulations, and plus attempting to collapse the Turkish economy by pushing Turkish Airlines to bankruptcy in cooperation with foreign powers. Whereas Turkish press law sets a time limit of 4 months for a legal process can be initiated regarding a news item published in a newspaper. In my case, the investigation into an ordinary economic news story published in 2014 was initiated in 2017 by the order of the Prime Minister, namely after 3 years of the publication of news story. There are, of course, many other stupidities and arbitrariness in this prosecution. And this case alone tells a lot about the character of the Erdogan regime and the so-called judicial system in Turkey. What sane country that calls itself democracy or the rule of law can treat such a farce as the rule of law or democracy? So I go back to my original question and ask, when will our Western friends and the democratic countries under rule of law understand the true nature of despotic Erdogan regime in Turkey and act accordingly? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kanesh, for showing the hilarity of the way in which certain governments and actors entreat with the regime as if it's still a democratic, legal, fair sphere. We will be moving on to a Q&A session based on the comments. We have a question for all of our panelists first, so whoever would like to address it, I'd love to hear from all of you. Could you elaborate on the concept of social genocide and whether you think it applies in this situation? Would anybody like to take this?
maybe Gökhan Toy can explain the concept of social genocide, because I studied and wrote a book about a real genocide, whether it the persecution in Turkey and torture and all the oppression in Turkey is whether it's in a volume of genocide or what kind of credentials of genocide were met in Erdogan regime. So according to my analysis, you know, sometimes the social genocide is not sufficient to define the exact situation in Turkey, because according to the 10 steps of genocide formalized by Gregor and Stanton, when we applied this schema to the developments or prosecutions in Turkey, the Erdogan regime fulfilled exactly 9 steps of a real, actual genocide process. The only steps maybe remained is the total extermination or how should I say, destruction of targeted groups of people. So I think, of course, we couldn't define what happened in Turkey as a genocide, but I think it is much more than a social genocide. It includes a huge practice of crime against humanity, but I think it is at the edge of a real genocide. It is maybe just a matter of time to see some extermination practices, despite we have some extermination practices in the individual framework, and this is actually sufficient to define what happened in Turkey as genocide according to United Nations Genocide Conventions, Article 2. But we should be conservative. We could be conservative about that, to not claim that this is a genocide. So the people prefer to use social genocide or crime against humanity, but I think it is not sufficient to reflect or present the reality in Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Kenesh. Mr. Toy, do you have any further reflections on that?
I would like to just thank Mr. Kenesh. He explained very well the framework of the description. Actually, from a legal point of view, I cannot make any comment if it's considered, because we don't have a legal term as social genocide. It is subject to a scholar discussion. But as Mr. Kenesh indicated, and as I tried to explain in my presentation, the acts and crimes of the Turkish authorities committed against the members of movement and the other the groups like Kurds, like some other minorities, these when we analyze them with the legal definition and the nature of the acts, they consist of the crimes against humanity. They satisfy the requirements of the crimes against humanity. And when we just look at the background of this legal definition, crimes against humanity, we should go back to the Nuremberg trials, like to World War II, to Holocaust. Social genocide, yeah, it may, I'm not an expert. There are many other precious scholars that they can discuss that. But I can personally make a comment that the approach of the society, Turkish society, the most of the society supports the commission of these atrocities, unfortunately. So in that sense, it is kind of social genocide.
Thank you very much. Just one further question for Mr. Kenesh and Mr. Kenesh, both of whom are journalists, like we said. Mr. Kenesh, I know you talked a little bit about your personal anecdotes, but if Mr. Kenesh could contribute as well, of how you were harassed or assaulted perhaps in your host countries, and whether you took legal action, not just raising awareness, but legal action, and whether that came to any sort of resolution besides awareness for the either of you.
Levent?
All right, let's give a pause to Mr. Kenish. Well, I reported to police, as I told in my presentation. My surveillance photographs were published by pro-Turkish government daily Sabah, and my addresses was disclosed. I reported it to the police, and it's still ongoing case. But frankly, we will see what will happen. They say there is a police unit here, intelligence and terror mix, is they call SEPO. SEPO is very much concerned with the issue. We will see what will happen. But as I already mentioned in my presentation, 2 of our colleagues were attacked in Stockholm, and the result of the investigation, it's not promising that something will may happen for our cases. And these 5 people's addresses, photographs, including Mr. Kenish, were disclosed and published by the pro-government media outlets. So it's not only 2 of us. About my another harassment is extradition request. Also, I'm on the list also, but I have quite a nuance other than Mr. Kenish. My extradition request was rejected by Swedish Supreme Court last year. So in terms of theoretically, I'm not in danger. My case is closed. This is good. I find it very positive. Hope all people who are on the list and the newcomers will be rejected by Swedish judiciary. I hope that should happen. That must happen, as Bülent abi already told that when Europeans observers or politicians will see that this is not a functioning democracy, this is not a democracy, this is an authoritative leader, and these are Congress courts, and the requests coming from Turkish courts are nonsense. It's a piece of paper only, not coming from a independent judiciary. So this is what I can say. I reported to the police, and the investigation has started.
I did similar steps vis-a-vis this kind of surveillance and taking hidden photographs, shooting hiddenly or secretly my videos together with my family, and even TRT News, TRT Haber came and published my house images and videos and claiming that the terrorist Bülent Keniş is living here, showing me and my family as target for the Erdogan fanatics here in Sweden and even in the other countries of the Europe. So I applied for the police, and I also informed to my lawyer to intelligence service of Sweden. And I contacted with numbers of civil society organizations like Lawyers Without Borders or Amnesty International, and of course the Journalists Association of Sweden. Their legal advisors also give support for my cases, and I also contacted with numbers of international lawyers in Geneva and Brussels, Strasbourg, to raise this question to related legal international bodies like UN bodies and European Court of Human Rights kind of things, and lobbying base, not the legal base. When Erdogan also demanded my extradition from Sweden in early February, I had actually any worry about this demand, because the Swedish system is a rule of law, and the legal authorities is totally independent from the executive bodies. So we thought that the Swedish law and the related European conventions are sufficiently protect us here. But unfortunately, my case, as different to Levent's case, came in coincidence with Sweden's and Finland's NATO membership application. So my name came to a kind of bargaining chip at the hands of Erdogan, and he, in 8th of November, during the joint press meeting with the Swedish Prime Minister, he mentioned my name. I followed a strategy about that, because Erdogan demand me to or bring me to the podium, and I couldn't refuse it. So I think I gave almost 50, 60 interviews to international media and including Swedish media. And then I assessed the situation with my lawyers, and then now we are preparing some preventive or preemptive measures to protect for any nasty developments. But I have still trust in Swedish legal system, so I expect nothing negative. But I try to create a kind of awareness in Swedish civil society, in politics, and in the media to create a blockage against any similar demand from Erdogan regime targeting some people here who have no similar opportunity to raise their voices and create awareness here. So my strategy was like that, and also my strategy is also aimed at taking into consideration that Erdogan regime continue to fabricate new crimes against targeted people. These are not political crimes, but criminal crimes or financial crimes. So I try to raise my voice to also bring these prosecution tactics, transnational prosecution tactics for Erdogan to agenda of the people.
Thank you very much. So like Mr. Levent kind of said before, the scope of our session was very wide, but I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to focus not only on people's individual rights, but also on community rights, both domestically and outside of Turkey as well. We will be ending our second session here unless any of our speakers has anything else to say. I'd like to thank all of you for making the time to be here today, to talk about your personal experiences, to talk about your reflections on the situation in Turkey and on the crisis of the rule of law. Thank you very much. We hope to see you in our third Freedom Convention session.
Okay, thank you.
No, Professor, I think you want to add something. Please go ahead. We couldn't see you. That's why we thought you left. Okay.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, in the light of everything else, I think we need to understand that there's sufficient evidence of atrocities that have been committed in and human rights violations that are there. What I think the world needs to understand is the respect for the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary and an independent free press. Those are fundamental cores to democracy itself. And if any of those pillars are taken away, obviously there's an erosion of human rights that will take place, and violations will take place across boundaries. It doesn't matter who or where. And I'd like to quote a judgment from our former Chief Justice Ismail Mohammed, the first Chief Justice of the Republic of South Africa in a post-apartheid democracy. And this is what he had to say. He said, respect for the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and that's my quotations, as well as an independent free press, is crucial for a defensible and durable civilization. Whatever the parameters of any meaningful debate on the meaning of the rule of law and its relevance and application in modern society, it is clearly premised on certain fundamental foundations. And then he goes on to say that the law has a sovereignty and a life beyond the life of the rulers in a country who come and go. That no person is permitted to take or remove what he considers to be his right, through unilateral action or volition in any dispute with one another, save through the intervention of a law fairly but vigorously applied through the courts, that the law must be rational and just, and ultimately that civilization itself is imperiled when these fundamental values are not vigorously defended by the rulers in any country. Now, what I'm saying here is, Professor, is the following. We have got the portfolio of evidence. We heard these kind of things. And I would like to think that when you come back next year this time, there will be some kind of a plan of action and a roadmap in defense of that rule of law. primarily because, as I said to you in my opening, in the South African Constitution, in terms of the equality principles, no one is above the law, and everybody is accountable in terms of the law. And hence we have a constitutional court that is the apex court that vigorously and jealously protects human rights, given what we've come through from a horrendous apartheid past. And I'm saying now is the time for us to basically, stop talking and start acting. We have these commissions of inquiries and the Human Rights Council, and we should invoke those. We have, as a group of concerned citizens, we can make representation to all these bodies. And like you see, if people go into a state of paralysis and say nothing can happen, then I'm afraid that you're throwing in the towel, which should not be so. In the height of apartheid in 1976, after the Soweto riots, the United Nations then finally declared apartheid to be a crime against humanity. And in terms of the crime against humanity, any state, any officer of state who basically was in the employ of the state that perpetrated any of those violations could be tried for a crime against humanity in the criminal tribunals. Now, that particular convention is still there. That resolution is still applicable in the United Nations. Now, obviously, if we expand that definition, obviously within the framework of the rule of law, we can basically go and say that fundamental rights have been violated. And therefore, we call for commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions. Now, I'll just give you one example here, if I may. The Human Rights Council has established international commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions and investigations to respond to serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, whether protracted or resulting from sudden events, or to promote accountability for such violations and counter impunity. These investigative bodies are supported by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, who provide administrative, logistical, as well as security support and expertise, and carry out missions as mandated. And to date, 28 such commissions and missions have been created by the Council, with 7 of them currently alive. It could be even more by now. But I'm saying these are the mechanisms that we need to be engaging in now, to create carbon footprints. Now, I'll end off by saying what I've learned in my journey on human rights. And that is, post 1945, there was a poet, he's not a poet, a pastor. His name was Pastor Nimola, and this is a famous quotation because he said, and then they came for the gypsies, and I wasn't a gypsy, so it didn't matter. And then it came for the different groups of people, and I wasn't any part of those group of people, and it didn't matter. And then they came for everybody else, and I wasn't part of any of those organizations or things, and it didn't matter. And finally, they came for me, but when I looked around, there was no one to stand up for me, and then it mattered. So I'm saying is we need to become proactive as as civil society organizations. If we really want the 75th Universal Declaration, the anniversary of the Universal Declaration, to have any meaning, then it is incumbent upon all of us to basically join hands through strategic collaboration partnerships to make the difference. If we don't do that, obviously, then the battle will be lost, because what's happening is, the states are very powerful, right, everywhere in the world. They even use their intelligence in the diplomatic corps to violate international human rights law. So those countries that have a fundamental, they subscribe to the Universal Declaration of Rights and have a rule of rights-based approach to, protection and the promotion and the protection and the monitoring of human rights. These organizations, these countries, basically are duty-bound to warn the other countries whom they're hosting that they should not violate those human rights principles, you see. And if they do so, then obviously there is problems. Now, I'll give you one example. Take Kenya, what had happened in Kenya. I just heard this now, right, in this discussion, where they abducted a teacher from Kenya, right? And he said he's languishing in prison there without a due process of law and access to justice. Now, that in itself is obviously a violation of diplomatic privileges, right? So we should put pressure on those kind of states to say, you know what, it's going to erode your own rule of law in your own country if you allow other countries to do this kind of thing, where you get the embassies basically to use their intelligence to violate human rights laws. And you should basically put them on terms, and worst case, they call it, the highest term in international diplomatic circles, they call it the démarche, right? The démarching orders. That if you break the law one more time, then you do not have the privilege of being in our country. Those are things that are very powerful. Those are things that will basically tell, the host countries that, listen, you know what, this country is very solid on the rule of law. Don't mess with it, because if you do so, you'll compromise the country, and the country has the right to then ask you to please leave, because, that is basically a violation of international law in itself. So it is reinforced by different mechanisms that you have at stake. But I'd like to see us now going beyond this. And I'd like to say to us that here we have these 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's study this in relation to the powers of the Human Rights Council, right? They have, I'll give you one example. When I was a commissioner on the South African Human Rights Commission in 2017, we had problems in our country, civil and political problems in relation to the people who were the Khoisan people, right? They're the First Nations whose rights were being eroded. Now, they came to the Human Rights Commission and they complained, so we held a commission of inquiry, we put a report together, and we said to the South African government, in terms of what we heard, it is quite disturbing that you are violating the Bill of Rights in South Africa. Please fix up the problem and address the needs of the Khoisan people. And they said, yes, they'll do it. They acceded to our recommendations and our findings, and they said they will do it. And they didn't do it. Now, that was in 2017. So when South Africa came before the Human Rights Council now recently on the periodic review, right? The Khoisan people objected to South Africa's report to give them a clean human rights Bill of Health report in the international community. The Khoisan people basically said, South Africa, we told you that our rights are violated. You accepted the South African Human Rights Commission's report, but you did nothing about it. And then the Human Rights, the Human Rights Council basically said under the Universal Periodic Review Committee, South Africa, indeed, you have failed in your attempts to fix up the problem. We are not going to give you a clean Bill of Health on Bill of Rights. Go back and fix up the problem. That is very powerful because it sets very strong precedents, for the respect of rule of law and for the Bill of Rights. So I'd like to say these are the mechanisms that are there. These are the mechanisms that we need to talk about, because what we're saying is, in the end, if we want to transform our society into one which there is human dignity, freedom, and equality, which must lie at the heart of a constitutional order and the respect for the rule of law and human rights, we need to be serious about our own rights, how far we take it. Because you must remember, in apartheid days, if you oppose the apartheid government, right, even if you are not a communist, the apartheid government would lock you up exactly like what's happening now. And they say you're a communist, therefore we are, you're a threat to the state. Anybody who did not support the National Party in the apartheid days, and you can read that in The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela, you would find these things happening, right? And so anybody who was anti-apartheid was declared a communist, and as a communist, he was declared a terrorist, and as a terrorist, he would be detained indefinitely without a trial. Many people were tortured, many people died in detention. We have a case, for example, in 1971, there was a Muslim activist teacher. His name was Ahmad Timol, right? He was thrown off the security building of the South African government on 10th floor. He died, he died. And then, he fell off and he died. So the point is, what had happened was the South African government at that point in time told the world that this man committed suicide. Okay. And the world didn't believe them. So when we got freedom and democracy, the Amat Timor family asked the South African government to reopen this case. So the court reopened the case, and you know what? They found the perpetrator, and they basically had him charged for murder because that perpetrator did not apply for amnesty under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Act. There are many such examples. The other one that we're talking about now in South Africa that's going now before, and you can Google it as well, is the trial of Imam Abdullah Haroon. Imam Abdullah Haroon was a human rights activist who spoke through Truth to Power on social justice. He was from Cape Town, and he was very vocal in his opposition to apartheid. And he was brutally tortured, right, in Cape Town, and he died. Like Steve Biko, brutally tortured, naked, driven from Port Elizabeth to Pretoria in midwinter, naked, right, tortured to death, and he died there. Now, all these things are coming out now in the South African scenario, and that is why in my opening, I made a remark that we said that we are a transformative society. We want to promote the egalitarian values of that. And our constitutional court will not stop at that. So that's what I'm saying is, and we are party, I must put it on record, to the International Criminal Court.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you because the other session will start in a few minutes. And I infer that you touched on really important, points. I infer that one, either individually or organization based, we have to go on the fight. And the other thing, in South Africa through the apartheid, in Turkey the huge purge, people are facing actually the similar experiences of the collapse of rule of law. So why not learning from others' experiences and coming together in the fight, in the international fight for justice and establishing democracy?
So lastly, I just want to say that let's look at the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights again. Let's study again the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, yes, right, around women being tortured and detained. And let's look at the Convention of the International Convention on Rights of the Child, right, yes, where children are languishing into prisons right now with their mothers. I mean, that's abhorrent. I mean, it's even against Islamic law, where you get a mother giving, who just given birth, that has gone straight into those things. So those are gross international human rights violations that can take place by, in any society. So the instruments are there, the law is there. It's just how you access your justice to make it happen. So I'd like to thank you and everybody else.
Educating ourselves, educating others, and know the tools to fight it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.
That was a brilliant conclusion to the session. Thank you for pointing out, like Ms. Girdab said, the explicit tools that people can use in their struggle for justice. That marks the end of our session. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Sweda. Thank you, Professor Fido. Bye-bye, everybody. Lovely meeting you all.